Hello everyone and a very warm welcome to the India Conference at Harvard 2022. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the India Conference at Harvard is hosted by both undergraduate and graduate students at Harvard University. We have a strong legacy of bringing together leaders, thinkers, experts and practitioners across government, business and civil society to enlighten and illuminate us regarding the most crucial matters and affairs that India is faced with. In light of current circumstances given COVID, we've decided to go virtual this year in engaging with our audience and leveraging our platform, which provides us with a fertile ground for deep discussions while celebrating the intellectual diversity that forms the very foundations of our identity. Before we start today's discussion, I would like to go briefly over a few housekeeping items. We will kickstart the panel, which will go on for about 45 minutes, following which we will open up the session to questions and answers. We value our audience engagement more than anything, and we hope that you will use this time to further probe the arguments that our speakers make. Please use the question and answer function you see on your screen to post your questions. You will have an opportunity to upvote questions. We encourage you to utilize this function if you spot a question that is similar to the one that you have, instead of entering it separately. Upvoted questions appear on top of the pile and will be presented to the speakers. We also request you to please tag us and use hashtag ICH2022 to tweet and share your favorite quotes, insight, and movement from this session. Without further much ado, I'll introduce our speakers for today. Santa Khurai is a Manipuri indigenous Nupi Manabi, which can be translated as a transgender woman in English. She's a gender rights activist, writer, poet, artist, and researcher. She's the secretary of All Manipur Nupi Manbi Association and is also associated with a national organization called Solidarity and Action Against HIV Infection in India. She has worked as a community coordinator at the Transgender Grievance Cell under the Manipur State Commission for Women. Dr. Aqsa Shaikh is an out and proud trans woman. She is an associate professor of community medicine, nodal officer for the COVID Vaccination Center, Hamdard Institute of Medical Sciences and Research. She is one of the investigators in the clinical trial of Sputnik 5, investigator in the Transcare project, and the WHO Unity studies on COVID. She's a co-investigator in transgender studies on human health, access, and medical curriculum at Sangat, India. Aqsa is the founder director of the Human Solidarity Foundation. Vqueeram Sahai is a teacher and researcher. They are interested in sex, feeling, and the structure and narrative of living in their relations with forms of sociality, law, and politics. They have previously worked as faculty at the Gender Studies Department, Ambedkar University, Delhi, and as a consultant on a project to study non-normative sexuality and gender housed at Advanced Center for Women's Studies at TIS Bombay. Akhil Kang, who is going to be our moderator, is a PhD candidate at the Socio-cultural Anthropology at Cornell University. He is interested in the shifting the anthropological gaze away from the lower caste individuals and understand victimhood and woundedness as articulated by upper caste individuals. He is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersections of several fields including feminist and queer studies, affect and media studies, post-coloniality, and biopolitics. Prior to enrolling at Cornell, Akhil received his BA LLB from Nalsar, Hyderabad, and is a registered advocate with the Bar Council of Delhi. Over to you, Akhil.
Thank you so much, Rohin. And thank you for having all of us. And I'm very excited to talk and hear everyone else's thoughts. So I thought I'll start this panel by so I hate these generic questions like, what is the future of LGBT movement in India? Because I feel like that just places this undue burden on all of us, as if we have the clear answers to kind of imagine what these futures look like. Also, like those kind of questions completely miss out our unique kind of perspectives and positions, especially in terms of religion, caste, class, locations that we come from. So, and this is something which I've also been grappling with, because so much of so much of the queer discussions that come out of South Asia, specifically India, is really revolved around Section 377 of Indian Penal Code, which now stands decriminalized. But post that kind of really iconic moment, there's a lot of engagements that have happened. A lot of specific state governments all over India have set up transgender councils and boards. And there's also the recent kind of activism plus legal battle towards same-sex marriage, which are all kind of deliverables, so to say, desired by people from all over. But I feel like these discussions often tend to miss out on a lot of these other identities: trans, Kothi, Indigenous, and other kind of formations and collectivizations that happen. So I want to hear, like, how do you step into these discussions, and how do you kind of like see yourself in this narrative? I want to start with Aqsa. Maybe we can begin with you. Yeah.
Sure. In the last decade or so, we have seen how there has been a buzz around gender identity. There has been a buzz around the term transgender persons. We had the NALSA judgment, very optimistic and positive. Then we had an act which was made for the transgender persons, which was opposed by the transgender persons, and which was passed with force. We had a National Transgender Council being formed, which raised a lot of questions on the democratic process by which it was formed. And then subsequently, the rules and the various other acts that have come, they have really pointed out to the lack of understanding, to the kind of paternalistic attitude which has been in play. So to give an example, for the benefit of the audience, is the Transgender Act, which was heavily opposed. And one of the core things in the act which was opposed is that as a transgender person, I do not have the right to identify myself as a man or a woman on the basis of my gender identity. I have to undergo some kind of surgical procedure, and then I have to satisfy a district magistrate. And if His Highness or Her Highness wishes, only then I'll get the gender identity marker. So there has been, a lot of focus on getting this surgery done, on kind of correcting our bodies into the males and the females. So I actually call it a surgical strike on the transgender rights, which has happened. And it kind of, tells transgender persons that are actually like intersex persons who need some kind of correction to fix them into one of these two tick boxes of either males or females. Otherwise, you can identify yourself as a transgender person with limited rights. When I say limited rights, for example, if my passport has transgender identity marker, there are many countries which do not recognize it and I'm not allowed access to them, or I have to go over there in a gender with which I don't even identify. If I have to undergo MTP, I have to be identified as a woman legally. If I have to undergo ART Act or Surrogacy Act, I'm denied those as a transgender person. There is no option of transgender when you go for adoption in India. So these are just, some of these red tapes everywhere, which says that if you want to access these services, you have to fit into the binaries of male and female, and only then you are allowed to go past these barriers. This, I feel, is like imposing the binaries on the transgender persons in the name of their welfare. And there's a heavy focus on surgery. And I again want to re-emphasize it. So now it says that the Ayushman Bharat will cover transgender persons. The focus again is on empaneling plastic surgeons who will perform surgeries, sex correction or sex assignment surgeries on individuals. I'm not using the word gender affirmation procedures because actually it mentions sex change surgeries. If you look at the SMILE program, which has been launched for the transgender persons just last week, again, the focus is on surgeries. If you look at the Garima Grah initiative, that actually is like putting trans persons into hostels or like correction homes and, kind of reforming them through systems of discipline, skilled labor, and so on. there is no freedom for trans persons to even choose with whom they want to live. So the act says that if your family refuses you, then you will be rehabilitated somewhere. So there are a lot of these problems which makes us feel that it infantilizes transgender persons. There's a very paternalistic attitude which is there, which says that there will be sabka saath, sabka vikas, but we will decide how that vikas has to be done for you and not by the transgender persons themselves. Over to you, Akhil.
Thank you so much, Aksa. That was really, really helpful. And thank you so much for pointing out specific instances also where there's been a huge kind of lack of how how the knowledge about how certain bodies should be kind of lived out is just completely falling flat on the government. And also, thank you so much for pointing out that there's been a huge, huge mobilization against the legislation that has come out, which the government did not take into account at all the oppositions that were happening against the legislation. And I want to quite quickly point out that the Nalsa judgment, which basically kind of gives the full right to people to kind of self-identify their gender, and was, at least in text, was one of the most well thought through judgments that have come out of the court. The fact that it wasn't implemented, or some states took it more than the other, is still a matter of debate. But this judgment came way before decriminalization even happened. And I guess, Aksa, what you were telling us really points out towards that there's so many concerns which don't quite fit the mainstream narrative of decriminalization and same-sex marriage, which is why, like, all these things just become fringe, at least in terms of LGBT movement in India. And I feel like it's just so urgent for us to talk about medicalization and these extremely violent and transphobic ways in which the government agencies understand certain bodies. I mean, just to point out that even the whole a bit about correction homes, I mean, there's been so much work and there's so much kind of literature judgments around how the governments deal with child marriages or women who run away from their homes, full consent, age consent. I mean, there's so much happening in terms of the kind of just paternalistically gendered way in which courts treat these women who want to marry with the person of their choice. And this is kind of like exactly how the government is dealing with, trans and hijra folks, that they just don't understand what people are trying to say. But thank you so much, Aksa, for pointing all those things out. And Santa, I want to take it to you that how do you kind of see all of this happening and going on?
Thank you, Akhil. Like, I have been in this movement for all these years long, like for the last 15, 20 years. And I had been taken a very important roles in the larger movement of for the freedom of queer community in India. I took part in Section 377. I took part in, against the Trans Act. But here what I realize myself is like, how do people see, how do the larger queer community from India look upon me, and then how do they see me, and then where do I position myself is a very is a very big question to me, because for me, like, the place where I come from is a very isolated place in the even in India. And then the stories of this land is not in the textbook of India, and people hardly know where they exist. People got to know there is a land called Manipur from the map only, but people hardly understand the cultural paradigm, social paradigm of the peoples of this land. So people are genuinely unaware, maybe genuinely unaware of the cultural and social paradigm. So in this context, talking about the rights for and the freedom of the queer community from the indigenous perspective is a very difficult and then elusive thing, because many of the time there is always this overshadowing of our narratives by the larger majoritarian queer community. So there are also a lot of misinterpretation in this movement, when somebody is from the minority, within the minority, speaking up about this diversity, many of them often try to, like impose certain thing over these narratives. So this is what I feel, because, like at the end of the day, the thing is like, whatever we are talking about diversity, inclusion, and solidarity, it always fails until and unless we have this ability to recognize the existence of this diversity, until and unless we have this ability to, like to bring in these peoples in the larger queer discourse. It doesn't mean that we are completely left out in the development. We are there, but how do people see us? How do people position indigenous, Northeast indigenous queer peoples? This is a very big question, because understanding gender and sexuality identity from the indigenous perspective has not been adequately addressed. And the non-recognition of the native LGBT in the domestic and international LGBT framework is erasing the diversity in queer society, and even it fails to accurate representation and unable to voicing the collective efforts of LGBTIQ plus human rights. And also in Manipur, the community find disassociated with the larger LGBTIQ narratives, because, as I have said, that we belongs to a very different paradigm. Because like we find very difficult to accommodate with this other uh, different socio-cultural background, with other people coming from different socio-cultural and linguistic wealth. So it creates more confusion of varied contexts and cannot accommodate in the existing knowledge and forcibly assimilate to the mainstream LGBT narratives in various aspects. And the other thing is like, we also do have, uh, you know, social organization to celebrate pride and our identity. These are all executed through traditional format. For instance, Thabal Chongba. It's a kind of pride march. Actually, it's not a march, but it's a kind of social organization for the queer peoples, basically led by the transgender women. And the absence of sexuality in Manipuri language. Manipuri language is a gender neutral language. We don't have this gender pronoun. And sometimes when I try to, say gender pronoun someone, like, uh, I found very difficult, and then I did a lot of mistake, like he, she. We use ma. Ma is commonly used for, it's a common gender pronoun. It's not actually gender pronoun. It's a common representation for both men and women. So this absence of sexuality in Manipuri native language is also a challenge to educate sexuality issues to the native community. And the other thing which I realized from my research is like, Manipuri transgender people, Nupi Mandi, doesn't depend on sex work for livelihood. Hence, the statistical data on transgender livelihood, but as a, traditional ways of earning is a big question, because, like all the projects coming in are focused on trans sex work. So many of the organizations are also doing this HIV program. And then how do they execute their program? Because they are deliverable, project deliverable. So how do they represent the indigenous Nupi Manbis narratives is also something questionable. And, like in the context of transgender, we don't have this history of genital mutilation and feudalistic and familial structure like Hijra, Kinnar in India. The community live either as men or women without sex reassignment surgery. And like we are a very complicated, we are in a very complicated context, because the community live in between the society and the law. So like, and the other thing which I wanted to flag out here is about trans men Nupa Manbas sports. Like sport is a folk culture in Manipuri society, and many Nupa Manba trans men get rejected in the formalized sport institution, because of their gender identity and gender marker in their ID document. But uh, the other thing of this narratives is like in the traditional sport space, like Thangta is a kind of traditional martial arts. People are not questioned about their gender identity, gender expression. They are given this liberty to leverage to perform in the way what they wanted to express their gender identity. Women can behave like men, and then men can behave like men. The only thing is like they have to learn the martial arts sufficiently. Okay, so here the formalization of sport institution is not allowing many Nupa Manbas to get admitted in the sport authority. And the non-mentioning, I wanted to pick up Supreme Court NASA judgment here, the non-mentioning of the Northeast Indigenous transgender cultural identity in the 2014 Supreme Court NASA judgment, and reinforcing the community to do sex reassignment surgery in the Trans Act 2019, Trans Rule 2020, to get either male or female gender marker is completely annihilating the existence of indigenous, Northeast indigenous transcultural identity. And like, hence, I feel like we get colonized under the mainstream LGBTIQ paradigm and invisibilize our ground reality. So this is what I feel, but I don't know people are hearing me, my community or not, but I will never give up. I am always going to speak up for the rights of indigenous community. When I say the rights of indigenous community, it's not asserting our rights to the central government, but actually to the queer community also, because this is very important. The failure of recognizing this diversity is a very big obstacle to the queer unification across the globe. This is not about India. This is about the global community. Thank you, Akhil.
Thank you so much, Santa. Wow, that was so powerful, and you gave us so much. And I just want to kind of quickly reiterate what you were saying, which you said really powerful, that how the mainstream movement is colonizing us, which is just a powerful sentence to say, and I want to kind of stay with that. And also, and you spoke about dissociation, and I feel like all of us in our kind of own capacities are also dissociated. And I mean, thank you for also kind of problematizing diversity, inclusion, assimilation. I mean, what you're saying is actually so powerful in terms of your own indigenous identity, and how mainland India completely disregards identities which don't fit into that narrative. And I mean, from Aqsa kind of pointing out these really specific instances in which the government and medical institutions are wreaking havoc, to Santa, to just really kind of pointing out, even within these queer or trans identities, there's just so much happening in terms of individual subjectivities and, really importantly, linguistic locations, which really shifts the way how we even identify with these collectives and with these terms. I mean, you just told us so much. Like, I feel like, Santa, you were kind of making a very strong indigenous critique of, I mean, using sentences like assimilation, development world, because so much of that resistance comes from indigenous worlds. And you kind of are using that knowledge to also point out to us how differently we are situated within the queer movements. And I mean, I am absolutely a huge fan of your work. I love how Santa is not just doing the work of talking to local government bodies, but also holding academics and researchers accountable. For instance, the book that was written on trans men, I believe you literally went to the road and burnt that book, which was the most amazing thing ever.
Faida. Faida.
Yes.
That
So,
was,
yeah. Go
uh,
ahead.
can I? That
Yes,
was
please.
really interesting. That was inspired when I realized that I was not able to fit in the like mainstream queer narratives. That's why I had started trying to find out the historical existence of this diversity in the erstwhile Manipuri society. And then it was a very difficult research because Manipur faced layers of colonization. The first was Burmese invasion, then Hindutva, then the third one was British colonization, and all the institutions were what to say, were all taken away by this colonization, because every colonization there were new infrastructure, new laws, new constitution in Manipur that were taken place. So like the institution that were once dominated by these unconventional gender and sexuality peoples, they it were all dismantled by this colonization. And then it was very difficult to uncover the stories of their existence. So it was
All
a
right.
very tough task.
Thank you so much, Santa. And honestly, us like lower caste LGBT queer folks have constantly been told that we are dividing the movement by bringing in issues of caste. So I completely like relate with you, and I have so much to learn from you as well. Vikram, over to you. I want to hear what you think about all.
Thanks, Akhil, and also all the organizers. I also want to begin by extending my solidarity with people at Harvard who are fighting the sexual impunity of a certain professor and cohort of people. All of us are extending our solidarity there. I do want to begin there. And it's really with the question of impunity that I want to put forth certain kinds of things with regards to Akhil's initial provocation, because I think my ability to respond to Aqsa and Santa is right now limited because I've just received it. So if we were to kind of go back to the conversation even on Section 377, because at least even if the judgment came after Nalsa, the mobilization around 377 is at least 2 decades older than the Nalsa mobilization, whose own history in a NGO setup has been completely erased, right? So like who the petitioners for Nalsa were, whether or not they were representative, etc., are actually things that we don't talk about enough. But what I do want to insist is that throughout this whole struggle, whether Nalsa or 377, what remains common to both struggles actually is precisely the construction of a certain kind of working class trans sex work identity as the story of evidence, right? Which is that those are the stories that were taken to the courts to show that citizenship is not really fully available. Yet the rights that came out of both judgments were precisely those that went to respectable Hindu queers or Hindu trans people, right? So in both stories, both which were actually stories about police violence became stories about respectability and about a certain kind of respectable queer citizen. And this is really tied to, say, for example, everything that came after Nalsa and 377 is like whether the gay marriage debate, which is being championed by a certain kind of caste nexus to which I belong, actually, or whether it is the National Council, which Aqsa clearly pointed is not representative at all, right? And it's precisely this whole thing about representation over reservation, which was actually highlighted in the Nalsa judgment, that has become kind of the central economy through which trans lives are now located. So we are seeing a greater and greater kind of presence of trans people on Vogue and Cosmopolitan covers, in films and in national councils, precisely because the conversation has become about representation, right? Rather than about reservation, rather than about access to safe spaces, whether even on the street, and of course, not at all about police violence. In fact, there is now no longer a challenge from the queer community to the police state, which has become even more difficult because during the COVID pandemic, at least the relationship of the trans community or actually working class queer communities was all mediated by the police, because the police took over the welfare function of the state, right? So rations were being distributed by the police and so on and so forth. So it is really difficult to now challenge police violence, which remains actually still quite dominant. The stories have disappeared from newspapers and so on and so forth, but any of us, all of us actually can testify to the constant SOS calls that we continue to get, right? And instead, we have entered a full economy of the medicalization of trans identity, which is where transness is only understood as a medicalized gender, right? So it's not simply the boards or legislation actually, but even if you were to see cultural representation of trans people, like the recent film with Ayushmann Khurrana called Chandigarh Kare Aashiki, the only thing trans about this person's story was the fact that she had a surgery, right? There was nothing else that was trans about her. And like Shanta is pointing to, a surgery is actually is actually not a dominant imaginary in the trans communities in India, especially because often sex work does not rely on surgery. And that's the other kind of thing, is precisely the kind of depoliticization of sex work, precisely by kind of making it as a certain kind of thing that trans people are only compelled to do, right? And it is the kind of developmentalization of sex work, as if given the option of livelihood, trans people wouldn't do sex work. But as Weber Saria's recent book really shows us, is that sex work is actually quite interestingly tied to trans community making, trans economies of love and intimacy, and so on and so forth. So what I do want to insist is precisely that the current moment is one in which the conversation of police violence, which was really where the movement actually began, whether even in the development sector of HIV/AIDS activism, has completely disappeared. We have been overtaken by a visual economy of the making of visuality of trans people, whether by the state, which uses the visuality of trans people on its posters or on its boards or on welfare boards, etc., without actually doing anything. These welfare boards haven't brought out any policy that has been useful. Or whether in terms of cultural, the tipping point, the trans tipping point in India, which we're currently witnessing, which is again the kind of the visual colonization of trans lives. And so I think in some sense, it is only in the fractures of these three that we can actually start to pay attention to where trans and queer, especially working class, non-Savarna lives are being led, for which I am really not a representative voice. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I mean, I was just going to my next question to all of you was going to ask how your locations are always put in opposition to mainstream locations, and I feel like all of you have already kind of very beautifully answered these questions. And I haven't even looked at the Q&A, but I already feel like they're going to be questions like how can we better allies and whatnot. And I feel like y'all are pointing out to so much more, right? Like to Vqueeram, especially saying that there's just so much more happening. And, people often kind of try to project their universal fantasies onto us, saying that, okay, so how do you deal with A? How do you deal with X issue? How do you deal with B issue? What about same-sex marriage? When in fact, all three of you are pointing out that actually we have urgent concerns, which are connecting to our bare life, to our everyday life. And that concern is not just about everyday interaction, but also how the law is understanding us, or how the government is understanding, and how the police interacts with us. And even that interaction with police is like really complicated, that you can't really take a very black and white narrative of police violence also that comes from US to other countries, right? So thank you so much, Vqueeram, for pointing that out. I want to specifically talk about the recent reforms in education, and especially the controversy that happened around NCRT, which is basically a national board which sets up textbooks for high school, both in private as well as government schools. And I guess, again, to point out Santa, who's already kind of laid out for us how diversity itself is just so mainstream and so kind of dilutes everything else. So, and like when the whole movement is towards inclusion, and when one talks about the education, how does kind of that fits? I want to start back with Vqueeram, but also Vqueeram give us like a quick context as well. What happened, like quick 1 sentence, 2 sentence context. And then after you, I want to go to Aqsa, then Santa.
Sure. So quickly, in terms of context, the National Council for Education, Research and Training reached out to a bunch of us to devise a teacher training module. This was not curricula for students as such. This was for teachers. So as to kind of grapple with trans, gender non-conforming and queer students in their classrooms, right? And so it equipped teachers with certain kinds of tools, with basic kind of FAQ kind of answers that they could bring to the classroom were certain kinds of queries to emerge. And so I actually was on the body, but I, because of my mother's ill health, couldn't participate in making the curricula as much. But we were reached out to about a year and a half ago, and then this basically almost 2 years ago, and then the curriculum came out last year, and then instantly a certain kind of right wing took up the idea, or especially kind of, and this answers really well to these kinds of transnational debates, the question of bathrooms being argued as when the module said that there should be single stall bathrooms that anyone could use irrespective of gender. The right understood it as saying that men and women will use the same bathrooms, which is what we were slightly saying, but because the looming threat of sexual violence in bathrooms became really important, but not just sexual violence, even sexual intimacy, because the wrong kinds of intimacies could be built. They could be interreligious, they could be intercaste, and so on and so forth. So it is at that it is the use of that curriculum that the right basically slammed the NCRT. A lot of people who worked on the curriculum from the NCRT were soon transferred to other departments, and then of course the curriculum was taken down by the government. So that's the kind of main background. The only two things that I really want to say, because I was somehow in the middle of it, even though I didn't really work on it, is one is that even though it seemed like the curriculum was that the state was quote unquote transphobic in bringing down the curriculum, one of the reasons why I, who was actually mostly attacked for that curriculum, was attacked was not so much because of the curriculum, but because of certain kinds of speeches that one had given at various kinds of platforms, in which I had slammed the present government for its occupation of certain parts of this country, and also for caste and religious violence that the government actually participates in. Yet, even though the resistance to my position was ideological, the certain people who worked for the mouthpiece of the government, or the mouthpiece of the government, then found images of me online that were slightly sexy, and then decided to use those to shame me. And what then became is that sex work itself, or sexiness itself, or slut shaming, stood in for all the things that were wrong with the curriculum, right? And so it was as if by being sexual, I was sexualizing the students by insisting on the use of bathrooms for the same gender, right? But it was precisely in the psyche of the right that these students were constantly sexual in the bathroom. So it's not really us, but it is precisely that kind of a fantasy that was being projected. What this actually is strange also because the right wing itself got some slamming from trads for their position, because then Modi ji was seen to be far too liberal in allowing people like me on the board. And so he was not being Hindu enough, and so on and so forth. So then even within the right, it had led to a certain kind of slamming of gender ideology that was being imported from Western contexts and brought into India. But at the heart of it was really the kind of slamming of a kind of masculinist Hindu national project that really got disappeared because the whole focus became about, again, my visuality and my transness rather than ideological position, which really, I think, it ties to what I was saying previously, is precisely the de-eroticization of sex work into a kind of completely material economy, rather than a kind of critical space in which people challenge borders, challenge intimacy, challenge other kinds of infrastructures that make the Hindu nation state happen, including the family. And so it is precisely that. And it's interesting because at the same time as the NCRT controversy happened, one of our great icons of the trans movement, Manjama, was awarded by state with the state award. And Manjama leads a great troupe of singers, dancers, and performers, and is one of the cultural arts icons of the country. But then my images were then being compared to Manjama's images, and which really tried to pivot to trans people who actually have far more in common than anything else against each other. But what it really propelled itself to is the idea of a certain kind of mythic colonized Hindu future, because Manjama's Jogappa identity is colonized into a Hindu identity, even though it has a certain kind of regional conversation. Most Hindus wouldn't even go for a performance because it's not in Hindi. To that was the future, and sex work is this kind of past that we all have to give up. And it's precisely that complex that the NCRT curriculum, in some sense, kind of opened for us. Again, those fissures that I think are articulating in many different ways in the movement. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vqueeram. And I feel like you, I mean, just all three of you are just giving us such like really intense, with so much depth, which really kind of points out towards like, let me just give you an example. When there's so much kind of mainstream demand of representation and all of that, I'm just like, okay, let's have a conversation about reservation and affirmative action. Like, how can Hindu queers or upper caste queers ask for representation and not understand how reservation works? Like, come on, how silly. So, and in that sense, my question to you was about NCRT education, and you kind of really gave us really radical ways of thinking of how inclusivity functions, and how that question about education reforms has to have had with self-determination, with kind of like mainstream right-wing trolling and respectability. Thank you so much, Vqueeram. We only have few minutes left before question and answers, but I want to hear Aqsa quick thoughts from Aqsa and then Santa. Aqsa, please go ahead.
Yeah, of course, Vqueeram, thank you for doing the work that you did in spite of all the backlash and the criticism. How you dealt with it, that was really very, very commendable. And just wanted to add also that, currently there's this debate over hijab in schools, which is going on. And it's also important to understand the intersectionality aspect. So for example, I identify as a Muslim transgender woman who covers her head. And as a result of which, I face backlash from both the sides, So there are these Muslims who are transphobic and therefore do not accept me. And then there are people who are woke, but say, oh, this is a sign of regression, why do you have to adopt this? So it's also important to talk about uniforms, and how that has a contested history with the trans children, and how, the administration is forcing boys and girls, and of course, the trans children who are invisible in this entire debate, into a certain kind of uniform, and to kind of erase the diversity, which we all have as individuals. Also, this entire NCRT controversy raised a big question on the watchdogs like NCPCR, which actually became the complainant, the National Commission for Women, the NHRC, how all of these are supposed to be watchdogs, but then these dogs have become too loyal to their masters, whom they were supposed to actually question. And these have all become political appointments, and all. If you look at the tweets of the people who are chairing these commissions and all, you will find that there is complete slavery to the master which is there. So that really talks about completely eroding all these systems, whether it is the commissions, whether it is the court, or whether even it's the transgender council, which is supposed to be putting the voice of the trans person to the government, but it's actually more than that, explaining the government's voice to the trans people and saying, okay, be happy, they're doing something about you. Also, I must say that we often do not talk about trans children or children in general, and the agency of children. But in the present regime, what we have seen is that children have been used as tools of subjugation, and getting them to do certain things. For example, getting them to read Bhagavad Gita in the school, getting them to do Surya Namaskar in the name of yoga. So there was this example where, in Kashmir, it became mandatory on a certain day to do Surya Namaskar. And we know that Muslims are not supposed to worship anything, whether it is sun, moon, or any other. But then it kind of gave an orgasm to the Hindutva terrorists that, see, the Muslims and the Kashmiris are now being forced to do Surya Namaskar, or the Muslim girls are being forced to remove their hijab if they want to enter, and that public humiliation and the videos which are happening. So there has to be also a larger debate on how it's not just one community, but across the various identities, the humiliation, subjugation is happening, and how children have been used, as those tools of subjugation and kind of visual orgasm which they are receiving.
Thank you so much. And I want to also point out to the audience just how much of radical work that all these three people do, and also put their bodies online. And by online, I don't mean online as in the internet, but like online in terms of kind of attacks, not just online attacks, but like in-person attacks, violent threats, and that threat is very, very real. And I want to point that, and I want to give that like really, really thanks to all three of you for putting yourself out there. I mean, in terms of just the kind of hate that people get. Okay, Santa, to you, last thought from Santa, and then we'll open up for question answers.
First of all, I would like to place my gratitude to all the people who have invested a lot of effort to make that training modules. And also, unfortunately, it was I don't know, it was very unfortunate for all of us that NCPCR has rejected the training module, because it's a very powerful and a very good training module. And the one thing that makes me very funny was NCPCR claims that the training module is discouraging the secularism in India, because the training modules talks about trans diversity. Okay. So, and the second thing is like, why the community were very silent when NCPCR taken down that from their website, the training module. People were very much active on section 377. People were very much active on Supreme Court national judgment translate. But the thing is like, since the beginning, we have demand inclusion in education, inclusion in hospital setting, inclusion in health care setting, inclusion. We always talk about inclusion, but actually a new things that's going to provide inclusion in education is going to happen why community are very silent. So this is a very big question. And then my experience on filing a case to the Supreme Court against banning of blood donation by the MSM transgender, gay, whatever it is. So why community are very silent on that? Because we have demand to repeal section 377. That's also important. Supreme Court national judgment trans right is also important. But blood donation is one thing that's very much important. If you are not allowing to donate blood to save people's life, then what is the point of getting the freedom to express our sexuality and gender identity? So there is a lot of, this appropriation between demands and the reality, politics and the community reality. So there is a lot of, larger politics that's not constructive taking place in India within the community. So we are failed to have this common aspiration within the community. So this max fails to, like, it's a threat to to the future of Indian queers movement. So there is a lot of hands. There are people who have a very good political affiliation with the central government there, and they are gatekeeping all this development. And this is a very big challenge, and I don't think we can resist against them, because they are very powerful. And for a person like me who come from periphery, it's again much more difficult to to resist this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sanda. And I want to thank all three of you again for the work that you do, and the power that you give for people around you and for people like me to kind of also extend, as a cis person, to extend my solidarity and to work with you, to learn from you. So thank you so much. I want to open up for Q&A, then request Rohin if you could take over for Q&A. And whoever wants to answer could step in.
Sure, Akhil. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for the work that you do. Uh, a question is from Dr. Gargi Kakani, and she asks whether legalism is the only way forward for the Indian queer movement, or should the movement be skeptical with the way it interacts with the law?
Vikram, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the lead on this and maybe other people can join in. So what I don't really know about the queer movement, but we might want to kind of disaggregate those things, because I think there is a kind of respectable queer movement that relies on the judiciary to avoid the messiness of politics. And then there is the judicialization of citizenship itself in the present moment, which is that with regards to rights as such, we're having to rely on the infrastructure of the judiciary more than the government. And this becomes really important for the trans community, especially because that is not even recognized, or the queer trans community, because it's not even recognized as a population or a vote bank as such, right? And so in the absence of like becoming a population, we are seeing that you cannot rely on the executive or the legislature to provide you with welfare. And so you're having to go to courts to get basic things like food and ration and medicines during the COVID pandemic. And I do want to say this really importantly, because at this moment in the authoritarianism of the present regime, there is no such thing as rights anymore. There are entitlements that people with certain kinds of backgrounds have, and everyone else's right is conditional to proving the test of belonging to a Hindu nationalist imaginary, right? And so in the absence of that, in the absence of belonging and citizenship, it is precisely that a certain kind of community, whether with the CAA, NRC protests, or whether with relief for COVID pandemic, people are having to rely on the judiciary. But we must actually know that the judiciary also, in most matters, really doesn't have the teeth. But that all of this is also about a certain kind of scalar economy that completely ignores all the ways in which provincialized trans communities actually, or queer communities actually provide for each other. And so the ways in which mobilization, organization of citizenship actually happens beside the state is actually ignored. But I'm going to stop there, and maybe other people, including Akhil, would have thoughts about this.
So I just want to add that, when it comes to creating legislations for the queer and the trans community, we are quite skeptical about the intention and the ways in which that is done. Our experience with the Trans Act has not been very good, and it probably took us, 2 steps behind than where we were. And just a few months back, the Surrogacy Act and the ART Act were framed to regulate how people reproduce and procreate and create families, and that has completely excluded queer and trans persons from the provisions of these acts. So the next act which comes will probably take away more of my rights, rather than bestowing rights or securing my rights. There is a role of judiciary, in fact, in some of the places, and that's commendable. For example, from the southern states of Kerala and Madras High Court, we have these judgments coming on convergent therapy, banning that, or putting a stop to the homophobic and transphobic content in the medical education. So these are the kind of places where legislation is required, like a proper law to ban conversion therapies. But unfortunately, the focus of the government in creating legislation is on something else. So as a community representative, I'm very skeptical about any being new laws, that they fiddle with.
Like, I don't know, I just wanted to place a few points on this, which I feel like it's also important. Like for me, based on our experience, transgender peoples cannot be taken as a complete subject of law, because when we talks about before this Nalsa judgment and then Trans Act came in Manipur, there was a very organic society, trans society. We were very open. People did not question about our body. People did not question about our lived experience. But after all this new development, the media and then other social organizations, they have started glorifying trans narratives, and they even question a lot of irrelevant question to the community. And a few social organizations, they have started like to give a separate kind of space in a religious space called La Harauba for the transgender people, which was not there before this development, legal development. So like it has completely erasing those organic narratives, those what to say, those realities now, because like the law comes, and then the mode of violence, the mode of narratives, the mode of conversation that's taking place has shifted to another paradigm. So like it is completely like maybe when we have some when we face violence or crisis, definitely we require support from legal fraternity and also from police personnel. But actually it doesn't mean that we always need to incline on all this, because in Manipur, transgender peoples had certain realities which is not cannot be compliance with this legal and then legal what to say. So this is what I feel.
Akhil, do you have any thoughts?
No, I mean, all three of them have said so much. I don't think I have more to add.
There are a bunch of questions, and since this issue also seems to be in vogue currently, uh, is that the current marriage equality movement seems to be divided from the caste and the class realities of the Indian queer community. Uh, what are your thoughts on that? And there's also a second question: is that do you think that is going to be something that is going to be possible in our lifetimes?
Give it 2 years, you'll get it. I mean, one has to realize that that the marriage equality question is actually one that was already tied into the Nagde Johar judgment and the Puttaswamy judgment. So the legal precedent for that to happen is already in place. Justice Swaminathan has already given a judgment that recognizes hijras and trans people's marriages, even though trans people have been getting married for years without the law actually stepping in. There is research around that question as well. So I don't necessarily think that the benchmark of the recognition of sexual intimacies or romantic intimacies between queer people is really the marriage question, because I think that is the easier one, especially, and you must actually see that question will get resolved as a anti-trafficking legislation comes into parliament, which will thereafter make it more difficult for sex workers and trans communities, particularly trans communities, to form filial relations, right? So, for example, the trafficking bill would make it would criminalize the giving of hormones to people who are not 18, right? But I mean, if you recognize how important hormones are for some trans children, then what you're basically doing is you're criminalizing trans kinship. So on the one hand, you will get the recognition of the hetero married couple, the cis state, but on the other hand, all these traditional communities are being criminalized through precisely things like the surrogacy bill or the trafficking bill and so on and so forth. And maybe if we were to kind of widen the question of that, then how do you answer these questions without actually questioning, say, the large-scale homelessness of trans persons, without actually kind of locating various economies of the HIV/AIDS virus and the failure of the development state to actually address it, and without the kind of greater scarcity and precarity of trans queer lives, absolutely. And with regards to the first bit about it being divided, I mean, that's mere fact. If precisely the marriage legislation question can be won precisely by making it a respectable Hindu Savarna question. It cannot be won otherwise. This is how we won the Navteej Johar judgment as well. So it is deeply tied to that. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Just to add to that, and also to answer another question which has appeared in Q&A, which is like, can we see a trans CEO someday? I would like to put this question, if you have someone who is leading a hijra gharana, which has hundreds of persons, those are also leadership qualities. They are also CEOs. So when we say that CEO, we are not recognizing the existing leadership within the trans communities, the existing superb execution skills that have been going on since centuries, and which have stood the British oppression also. It's been since Mughal times. It's gone through the British. It has survived all the forms of governments, including emergencies and the current environment. So we need to recognize that and not say that only the corporate leadership is the kind of leadership which is there. So yes, trans people have been always leaders. They are leaders. We need to recognize that. Just to add to that, and to talk about the work being done by Grace Banu for horizontal reservation in the workplaces, that's a very important point that we must not forget, because when we speak about trans persons, trans people have religions, have caste, have regional identities. They come from contested territories, and therefore it's important to recognize and not to put them all in one mold. So the horizontal reservation is a very important point that has to be discussed over here.
Any more thoughts, or should we move on to the last question for today?
Last, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So another question is that how can we be better allies to the community? What do I do if somebody who comes out within the context of any other group I am a part of? So I think the question is more about how can cis people be better allies to the community as a whole.
Okay, so I'll quickly answer and then maybe others can pour in the thoughts. So I always say this, that if you want to be an ally, you have to give the mic to the people who are, whose welfare you are concerned about, and not speak for them, but create stages and platforms where these people can come and talk about their lives. They have to be on the decision making tables, and when I say they, it has to be a representation which is not just political appointment. And very important is to amplify their voices rather than speaking for them, which is what is happening right now. And also very important to look at the intersectionality, where are the Dalit trans persons, where are the tribal trans persons, where are the Kashmiri Muslim trans persons, are their voices being heard? This is the question. Where are persons with disability and transness, coming out? So it's very important that the minorities within the minorities are there on the decision making table and have the mic with them. And as allies, we are amplifying their voices.
Getting allies, talking about allies is something which is very controversial to me. If people allow me to share a short stories which I had experienced in a long time ago, then I would like to share this story, because this will definitely gives a kind of kind of reality to the peoples who wanted to be alive with the queer peoples. It was a late winter night. It was in Delhi, and I went for a conference, and I was supposed to stay in a very nice and sophisticated hotel. Then one Manipuri who was supposed to be like an ally of a trans community, this person invited me to stay one night at her rent room. I went there, and then the moment I went there, I enter this person's room. This person told me that he wanted to take 3,000 from me. He wanted to borrow 3,000 rupees from me, because this person was supposed to go to a birthday party, friend's birthday party. I gave the money, then we spent days together, and then evening came, and a few people started coming in her room, in this person's room. This gender pronoun is very confusing, and this person now identifies as gender non-binary. So like I don't know, it's very difficult to address this person's gender pronoun. So this person and people started coming. They have we had a little drink, and then like they have started having conversation in this party. And then I was also just chipping in the conversation, and they had this conversation in English language, and I also started speaking English. And for no reason, this person insulted my English in front of so many people. He insulted my English, telling that, oh, your English. He didn't say that my English was bad, but actually the way like he talked to me was very insulting and humiliated. And then just after that, I didn't respond to this person. Then after that, that was also for no reason. This person got high, and in front of, he's a Manipuri, okay, he's a Manipuri, he's from Manipur. And this person chased me out in the late midnight in Delhi. It was winter, late night, okay. He insulted me, he humiliated me, he taken away 3,000 rupees from me, and he chased me out. It was in Subjugation, and I was all alone. It was around 2 p.m. late night, and I was not able to get an auto that time. And he even did not say anything when I left the room. I was crying, and I called a trans sister who was living in another place in Delhi, and she rushed immediately, and she took me. She picked me up from there in an auto, in a higher auto. So talking about allies is very something that incidents was deeply rooted to me, and it has deeply wounded And these peoples are elite. These peoples have this privilege in education, and now they return back to Manipur and they are started doing project on transgender. So like, I don't know how to express this. I, as a person who is very responsible for more than 10,000 people, like, I feel very low when I see all this reality, because I don't have that privilege. I cannot speak good English. I cannot have this privilege to expand my network because I didn't get my study in a very good university. I am 12th dropout. So all these things are happening, and then talking about ally is something very difficult for me to answer, to give suggestion to people how people can be an ally for the queer peoples, because always there are things people are trying to climb ladder using our narratives. Based on my experience, people might be having good straight allies, but in my experience, most of the allies that I have encountered in my life. And then there was also one stories. I wrote a book. It's a collection of my memos. It's called Yellow Sparrow. And I have given this manuscript to a one cis person, cis lady, for translation. And then she had kept my stories for like 2-3 years. And finally, I've decided to change the translator. And then I wrote an email to her telling that I wanted to change the translator. And immediately she sent me a legal notice telling that breach of trust. What I did was breach of trust. And she had started publishing my stories section by section online because she have all this privilege. I'm not a techno savvy. I'm not good in publicizing my work, but I do a lot of work. But these allies, they just do a small work, and then the way they're publicizing their work is attempting to claim that my organization and my peoples are not doing anything for the community, and they are like our savior. They are doing everything for the community in the Northeast. So this is the reality. And for example, as we have said, like, ally can be in any form. Ally can also support a homeless person, trans person. There are a lot of rich people, and currently I don't have a house. I'm struggling for a proper shelter. And even the bank, I've approached bank. This bank did not allow me to get loans because my earning is very low, and my income is not eligible according to their terms and condition, because the work that I'm doing for my earning is not considered as permanent in the bank terms and condition. So there are layers of issues which we need to address. Like, there is no economic justice for the trans people, no economic inclusion. This all is that people wanted to do for the community. It's not, this is not, they do not genuinely want to do to support the community. They genuinely doesn't want to help the community. In my experience, they wanted to use our stories and promoting themselves. There is inclusion and diversity in some bank, but what did they do? I am a leader. I have been sacrificing my life for all these years long, but when my time comes, when I need some financial resources, that's for my home, to construct my house, nobody exists. People disappeared. So what is this? How do they define inclusion and diversity? So there are things which we really fail to understand. And the Legalism movement, when people talk about Section 377, we are we are struggling with this Armed Forces Special Power Act. Like, I was brutally beaten up by Indian Army for no reason in the late night. So in that context, should I demand the center to repeal Armed Forces Special Power Act or Section 377? Because I was affected severely by Armed Forces Special Power Act, but I was not that much affected by Section 377. So there is a lot of this reality which people often fail to understand. I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm crying.
No, please don't apologize. And Rohin, I believe that we're done with question answers, but I just want to kind of say that, Santa, I mean, we hug you, we want to extend our love to you. And I also want to kind of just point out just the beauty and like ferocity of these three people that we are sitting on this panel talking about these kind of radical ways in which we are kind of holding the government accountable, but also to be able to hold space for our grief and for our humiliation and for our shame, and for constant disappointment, not just by the state and not just by the elite upper caste, but also by people who we thought care for us, and which I feel is very, very close to queer and trans folks. And I want to kind of just extend that empathy. And we love you, Santa. We love you, Aqsa. We love you, Vqueeram. Yeah, I'm just feeling a lot of grief and anger, and I still again want to point out that Santa was doing the labor of not just expressing her grief, but then also connecting that with Section 377 and the fight with the Indian Army, which is the labor that these three are doing in the everyday. The concerns are not just about the legislation, but also about everyday homelessness, also about banks humiliating you and not giving you loans, also about so much other things that you are constantly grappling with. And I feel like that's, I mean, that's what I think ally should mean, just being respectful, just kind of extending empathy and asking you, not about, hey, what about trans CEOs, but hey, what do you need today? Do you need safe transport? Do you need some money to get by today for ration? And I feel like that's where allyship for me also comes from. But Rohin, if nobody else has any thoughts, do we end the panel? Up to you.
Thank you so much, Santa. That was so powerful. You moved all of us in the audience on the panel. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, all of you, Dr. Shaikh, Vqueeram, Akhil, Santa, for taking time out of your schedules and being here, being vulnerable, talking about stuff that needed to be talked about, and bringing out the issues so powerfully. The next session that we have is now on India's justice delivery system with Justice Chandrachud amongst others. Justice Chandrachud chairs the E-Committee of the Supreme Court, so that is definitely something that you might want to check out. Uh, I think the link should be in the chat to join that session. Uh, to all the speakers and audience, thank you for coming, listening, speaking, and asking. Akhil, thank you for your moderation. And thank you for the way you've managed this session throughout, even before we came on Zoom. Your participation has made this conference stronger this year, and I'm sure it'll continue to make it stronger every year. We look forward to seeing you next year, all of you, and thank you so much once again.